New videos are coming soon on Jaguar Gator 8 and Jaguar Gator 7. Now that the new studio is up and running, we have time to commit to those channels again. Make sure to click the link in the description so you can subscribe to the channels now so you don't miss a moment of the action. And now, on with our feature presentation. When a trade happens, even if the trade itself might be somewhat shocking and out of left field, 99.9% of the time, it's pretty straightforward in terms of the parties involved. There's one team looking to get rid of a player, and another team looking to acquire said player. The team trading away the player gives that player up to another team in exchange for capital of some kind, whether it's a draft pick, or money, or another player. In other words, there's no middleman. You're trading directly with that team, and you're not going through another third party. And I'm not talking about a three-way trade, because those things happen. I'm talking about being banned from trading with one team, but that one team really wants that player. So you trade with another team, who then trades that player to the team in question, so that the desired result can be achieved. Does that sound confusing at all? Well, this player right here is Tim Wilson, and that's exactly what happened to him in a bizarre trade situation that might make your head hurt, but is something that we've got to take a deep dive at today. Because in 1983, Tim Wilson started the season as a member of the Houston Oilers, and a few weeks later, thanks to a trade, was playing as a member of the New Orleans Saints, with a brief stop in Los Angeles with the Raiders for some reason. Tim Wilson had quite the career in the NFL, and this is just another one of those bizarre stories that you might not know about, that 40 years later helped etch his name into NFL history just a little bit more. Because this is the story behind one of the strangest trades in NFL history, and what has to be, without a doubt, the strangest trade of the entire 1983 NFL season. Before I talk about the actual trade itself in all its confusing glory, we need some context to understand just who Tim Wilson is, why the Saints wanted him so badly, and why the Oilers were done with him. Look, Earl Campbell is one of the best running backs in NFL history. You could make a legitimate argument, and I would absolutely say so, that no running back in the history of the sport had a better 3-year peak than Earl Campbell did. He practically single-handedly carried the Oilers offense in 1980 to the playoffs, because it sure as heck wasn't a past his prime, interception-prone Ken Stabler doing it. But as great as Campbell was, and trust me, he was great, he couldn't necessarily do it all by himself. He needed some good blocking. And perhaps there was no fullback in football who was better at blocking than the man that you've been watching this whole time. None other than Tim Wilson. When people talk about how great the Oilers were in the late 70s in the Bum Phillips era, Wilson is a highly underrated part of that equation, because there is no way that the Oilers have the success that they do if not for his contributions as a runner, as a receiver, and especially as a lead blocker. In fact, Earl Campbell acknowledged this fact, and acknowledged how important Wilson was to him and the team, that Campbell gave Wilson a watch in 1980 that said, "To Tim Wilson, 1,697 yards, Earl Campbell's rushing leader." But make no mistake, as great of a blocker as Wilson was, and trust me, he was great, as he was consistently opening up holes for Campbell, he could absolutely get the job done when called upon as a receiver and as a rusher. In the 4 seasons that Phillips was there as the head coach, Wilson had nearly 2,000 yards from scrimmage and found the end zone 9 times. Most notably, during the 1978 wildcard round against the Miami Dolphins, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, Wilson was one of the most important players on the offense, carrying the ball 14 times for 76 yards, and scoring the Oilers' first touchdown of the game when he caught a 13-yard pass in the first quarter in the end zone from Dan Pastorini. His impact on the team truly cannot be overstated. He scored Houston's only touchdown of their victory over the Cleveland Browns on Monday Night Football in 1980, a game which, had the Oilers lost, they would not have made the playoffs. He led the Oilers in both receptions and receiving yards during the 1979 AFC Championship against the Pittsburgh Steelers, a game where the Oilers got robbed with one of the worst calls of all time, as if the infamous play was ruled a touchdown like it should have been, and like it would have been if instant replay existed. They might make the Super Bowl, and NFL history looks very, very different. In a 1980 game against the Baltimore Colts, when Earl Campbell was hurt, Wilson picked up the slack himself, netting 85 rushing yards on over 6.5 yards per carry. You name it, and Wilson did it. He was an instrumental part in the success of the Oilers back then, and head coach Bum Phillips absolutely loved him. However, when the Oilers fired Bum Phillips after the 1980 season for his refusal to hire an offensive coordinator, due to the fact that the offense was incredibly stagnant and predictable, and the Ken Stabler trade didn't quite work out as Phillips hoped, the Oilers decided to erase anything, and I truly mean anything, that Bum Phillips did. If Bum Phillips did something, then screw it. Under new head coach Ed Biles, we're going to do the exact opposite. It was such an overreaction, and was such an obvious case of a new coach wanting to put his stamp on the team, even if it served no logical purpose, that it sent the Oilers into a downward spiral for the entire first half of the 1980s. And in one of the stupidest instances of that, Biles decided, hey, you know what would be a good idea? What if we took this guy right here, Tim Wilson, one of the best blocking fullbacks in football, Earl Campbell's leading blocker, and a pretty solid contributor out of the backfield in his own right, and with no rhyme or reason whatsoever, turn him into a tight end. Seriously. He even had to change his number from 45 to 89 to comply with NFL rules. Yes, Wilson was 6'3", and he was a pretty good catcher of the football who was solid in open space. But why are you trying to fix a formula that isn't broken? Campbell is the best runner in football. Wilson is creating all these holes and is doing pretty well when given a chance to touch the football. And you're going to change its position? Just because Bum Phillips hadn't played fullback? Needless to say, this didn't work. And shocker, in 1981 and in 1982, Wilson's production completely went down the drain, and he went from being a great blocking fullback to a completely useless player who was in a different position, as if the Oilers were trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. Said Wilson afterwards, on how bad the Ed Biles years were for him and for his position, that was what Bum did, and they didn't want to do anything the way that Bum Phillips did them. Wilson went from touching the ball 1,926 times from 1977 to 80, or an average of 483 times per season, to touching the ball just 68 times from 1981 to 82, or 34 times per season. 482 times under Phillips per season, to 34 times per season under Biles. Seriously, Ed Biles was that incompetent, trying to erase literally everything that Bum Phillips did, even though the foundation was clearly there. There was definitely some animosity between the Oilers and Bum Phillips, which, as you might have been able to guess, will play a pretty important part in our story later on. Because by this point, in 1983, Bum Phillips was a head coach of a different NFL team, as he had no problem finding work once the Oilers let him go. Phillips was leading the New Orleans Saints, trying to get them to not just their first playoff appearance in franchise history, but their first winning record in franchise history. And even though the Saints came close in 1982 to making it to the playoffs, Phillips thought that there was one piece in particular that was missing from their offense, which finished 26th in the league out of 28 teams in points scored. And that was the man that you've been watching this whole time, and the man that Phillips had with him in Houston during those glory years. None other than Tim Wilson. New Orleans' running game was fine. It was better than their passing game, at least, as Phillips decided to take Ken Stabler with him to New Orleans, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. But there was still room for improvement. Even though the Oilers were second in the league in rushing attempts, running the ball 331 times over 9 games, or nearly 37 times per game, they were 6th in rushing yards, 13th in rushing touchdowns, and 14th in yards per carry, barely finishing inside the top half of the league in the latter 2 categories. In the 3 seasons that the Oilers made the playoffs under Phillips, they were inside the top 10 in yards per carry, finishing 10th in 1978, 7th in 1979, and 1st in 1980. And they were inside the top 10 in rushing touchdowns, finishing 5th in 1978, 4th in 1979, and 8th in 1980. And even though the Saints didn't have Earl Campbell, they had former first overall pick George Rogers, a great running back in his own right. So with the right blocking in place, getting into the top 10 in those categories and playing Bum Phillips' style of football was not unattainable in the slightest bit. If the Saints could find a way to get Tim Wilson reunited with Bum Phillips, bring him to the Bayou, and see if he's got anything left in the tank at his natural position at fullback versus tight end, where Ed Biles stupidly had him play for the past few seasons, then maybe the Saints had something on their hands. The only problem? The Oilers wanted nothing to do with the Saints. The Oilers wanted nothing to do with Bum Phillips. Trying to get a trade done for Tim Wilson would have been a fruitless endeavor. It's like if you're in a fantasy football league with a guy who you absolutely hate because you were in a relationship and he knew about it and he got your girlfriend to cheat on you with him. And then he proposes a trade that benefits both parties. Even if it's a completely fair trade and it benefits you, you hate his guts so much that you refuse to do business with him. Even if the Oilers had no need for Wilson, seeing as he never touched the ball in 1982 despite playing every single game, and even if the Saints wanted Wilson, that trade was never going to happen in a million years. So that's when the Saints hatched up a crazy idea that 40 years later might be one of the craziest trades in the history of the NFL. What if we got a middleman involved? What if we got another team to trade for Wilson? And then that team can trade Wilson to us. With that, the Saints called up the Los Angeles Raiders and asked if they could do them a solid. Can you acquire Tim Wilson for us? Just find a way to get him out of Houston, and then we can take it from there. We'll do anything. And with that, the Raiders got Wilson from the Oilers in exchange for an undisclosed draft pick. Said Wilson on joining the Raiders, having no idea whatsoever as to what was about to happen next, "I'm leaving the Oilers with fond memories, but I do feel this is a good career move for me. I wish the team, especially my buddy Earl Campbell, the best of luck, and I look forward to September 11th when the Oilers come to Los Angeles to play us." Little did he know. Little did the man know. So you would think that the next step in this was for the Raiders to officially trade him to the Saints, right? Well, not quite. Because you see, when the Oilers and Raiders made this trade, the Oilers had a feeling that something was a bit fishy. Why would the Raiders, of all teams, want Tim Wilson? Why would the Raiders want a guy who did nothing the last 2 seasons and a guy who we think is past his prime? They led the league in rushing touchdowns, and they scored the second most points in football. Their offense was totally fine. The Raiders were one of the best teams in football, and the Oilers were one of the worst. And if he can't start for the Oilers, or do anything with the Oilers since he didn't touch the ball that season, why would the Raiders have a need for him? And they already had a pretty good fullback on their team, as they had, oddly enough, a former Oiler by the name of Kenny King, who made the Pro Bowl in 1980, and in the last full season in 1981, had over 1,000 yards from scrimmage. Heck, he was not even 2 years removed from having over 100 yards from scrimmage and a touchdown in Super Bowl 15 in that victory against the Philadelphia Eagles back when they were the Oakland Raiders. Why did they need Tim Wilson of all people? Something was up. And so, when the Oilers made this trade with the Raiders, they did it under a stipulation. Under no circumstances could the Raiders then trade Tim Wilson to the New Orleans Saints and reunite him with Bum Phillips. Look, the Oilers were a bad football team, a poorly run organization, and an incompetent mess of a franchise. But they weren't stupid. They knew that something about this didn't pass the smell test. And that threw a giant wrench in the plans to get Wilson to the Saints, because the Raiders were not allowed to make the trade with the Saints now. However, there was a crazy loophole to this. There always is. Because there was nothing in the agreement whatsoever stopping the Raiders from just outright cutting Wilson, subjecting him to waivers, and hoping that the Saints picked him up. It's a huge risk, obviously. If another team claims him, then the whole plan blows up in your face. But if no team claims him before the Saints, and the Saints were pretty high up in the waiver order, seeing as they missed the playoffs during a season where 16 of the 28 teams made it because of how shambolic the whole 1982 season was, then everything works out in some sort of convoluted way. So just to recap where we are right now in this whole saga. The Oilers trade Tim Wilson to the Raiders. The Raiders have no intention whatsoever of ever playing or using Tim Wilson. And the Raiders will now try and send him through waivers in the hope that he lands on the Saints. And amazingly enough, this plan actually worked. The Raiders waived Wilson. No one in front of the Saints on the waiver order, including the Oilers, acquired him. And he was able to fall to the Saints just like that. Keep in mind that there had not even been a single practice with the Raiders at this point. Literally, Wilson reported to camp, and the team informed him that he was being traded. And if you're saying that this was just a bizarre coincidence, that I'm overthinking things, and that it just happened to work out that way, but there was none of this middleman trading nonsense, and the Raiders actually had a plan for Tim Wilson, but they weren't impressed with him or something, or they changed their mind, don't take my word for it. Take Bum Phillips' word for it. Seriously, Bum Phillips confirmed the whole thing when a reporter asked him about it. He confirmed the grand plan. The rumors were flying that this was the plan all along, and Phillips, instead of denying it and just saying that he was happy to have Wilson back, confirmed that, no, this was the plan all along. As he said, "I guess you hit the nail on the head. The only thing is, Al can't say it," with Al referring to Al Davis, the owner of the Los Angeles Raiders, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. That raises the question of why, if the Oilers thought that this was happening, they didn't just reclaim Wilson off of waivers, seeing as they could have prevented this and essentially held Wilson hostage and keeping this cycle continuing. But regardless, after all of this chaos, and after all of this nonsense, Tim Wilson was now a member of the New Orleans Saints. And perhaps no one was more confused about all of this than, unsurprisingly, Tim Wilson himself, as he flat out admitted that he had no idea just what the heck was going on. He was caught in the crossfire. Said Wilson, "If I'd known this was going to happen, I wouldn't have driven out there and then spent 3 days driving back. It's a surprise to me." However, he was happy to finally be playing fullback again, where he belonged, and was happy to be blocking for George Rogers and to be reunited with Bum Phillips, where he had his previous success. Said Wilson, "Fullback is something I played for 5 years and most of my years in college. It won't be a big adjustment to move back to it. Staying at tight end would have been an adjustment." And naturally, Bum Phillips was pumped about the fact that Wilson was back in the fold, as this was the move he was desperately trying to make. Said Phillips, "Wilson was the best lead blocker I've ever seen. We want to see if he still is. but I don't think he's changed that much. He's still young, he's in good shape, and he hasn't had any bad injuries. Unfortunately, Wilson didn't quite have the role that he had with Houston, which is why you're not seeing any highlights of him with the Saints. He only touched the ball 10 times over the course of 2 seasons with the team from 1983 to 84. He didn't start any games, and picked up just 29 yards from scrimmage, so it was somewhat of an adjustment to go back to fullback, or he just didn't have it anymore. A little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. However, at least he got to end his career with the coach that he started it with, even if the whole process of getting him to New Orleans in the first place was absolutely insane. I'm not sure we're ever going to see another trade like this ever take place again. Tim Wilson goes from the Oilers to the Saints, with a brief stop in Los Angeles in between, with the Raiders acting as intermediaries, even though he never actually played a single snap in the regular season, preseason, or training camp with the team. Because even though Tim Wilson never actually played at all for the Raiders, and never even so much as wore a Raider uniform, 40 years later, he deserves to be remembered for his role with the Raiders in one of the strangest trades, by far, in the history of the National Football League. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.